Hello, and thank you for listening. My name is Aggie. I'm a second year English student at the University of Oxford, and this podcast accompanies my article, Shared Threads, Gendered Violence and Collective Reconstruction in Post-Genocide Rwanda. This piece emerges from a longer standing interest of mine. Gendered violence has always mattered to me, not only as an abstract issue, but as something that shapes how individuals live, remember, and rebuild their lives over time. And yet, I've often felt that the Rwandan genocide, particularly the experiences of women within it, is too often reduced to numbers or quietly recedes from public attention. This podcast is an attempt to resist that kind of forgetting that accompanies my article, to stay with the question of what recovery actually looks like, not just as a completed process, but as something lived, uneven, and ongoing. So, why this story? When Rwanda is discussed today, it's frequently framed as a success story, a country that has rebuilt with remarkable speed and a model of post-conflict recovery. There is some truth in that. Since 1994, there has been sustained economic growth, significant investment in infrastructure, and a notable increase in women's political representation. But I found myself returning to a different question: what sits beneath that narrative? What does recovery look like at the level of everyday life, particularly for those whose experiences were shaped by forms of violence that are much harder to quantify, much harder to publicly acknowledge? Because national recovery and personal recovery do not always move at the same pace, and sometimes they do not move in the same direction at all. So, for some background and context, the genocide in Rwanda unfolded over 100 days in 1994, during which between 800,000 and 1 million people were killed. Alongside this mass violence was the widespread and organised use of sexual violence. Estimates suggest that between 250,000 and 500,000 women and girls were subjected to rape. This violence was not incidental, but it was systematic, used as a means of terror, of control, and of dismantling social structures at their most intimate level. Its effects did not end with the violence itself, though. Many survivors had lived with long-term health conditions, including HIV. Others have raised children born from these acts of violence, often within communities where stigma persists. Social reintegration, in most cases, has been partial and uneven. In this sense, the genocide cannot be understood as an event confined to the past. Its consequences continue to shape lives economically, socially, and emotionally. So, to understand the present, it is important to recognise how layered the roots of the violence were. Colonial administrations in Rwanda had long institutionalised ethnic divisions, embedding identity into systems of governance, education, and social classification. These divisions did not disappear with independence, they hardened, becoming part of political life. By 1994, this history had been mobilised into something far more dangerous, a coordinated campaign of violence that drew in not only militias and soldiers, but civilians, neighbours, colleagues, even acquaintances. This is part of what makes the aftermath so complex. Recovery is not only about rebuilding infrastructure or governance, it is about reconstituting trust in places where the social fabric itself has been ruptured. So, the justice and its limits. In the years that followed, Rwanda implemented multiple forms of justice and reconciliation. Among the most significant were the Gagaka courts, local community-based courts designed to process the vast number of genocide-related sexual violence cases. On one level, these courts were pragmatic. The scale of violence meant that conventional judicial systems could not cope. Gagaka created a space for testimony, confession, and, in some cases, accountability, but their limitations are equally important. Sexual violence cases were often underrepresented or handled in private, restricting public acknowledgement. Survivors were required, at times, to testify within the very communities where the violence had occurred. The line between justice and exposure could become painfully thin. International mechanisms, such as the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, faced their own challenges, particularly in the early prosecution of gender-based crimes. What emerges is not a failure of justice, but its partial reach. Legal processes address certain dimensions of the genocide, but not all. And for many women, recognition in a legal sense did not translate into social acceptance or personal recovery. So, my article looks at where recovery actually can happen. It is within this gap between formal justice and lived experience that the significance of smaller community-based structures becomes clear. The Abasangiye Cooperative, based in Kayonza in eastern Rwanda, is one such space. Formed by 25 women who experienced the genocide and its aftermath, the cooperative began as a small training initiative, supported by organisations such as Survivors Fund and Indigo Africa. Members learned textile skills, literacy and financial management, tools that allowed them to participate in local and international markets. Over time, income levels have improved, but to focus only on the economics would be to misunderstand what the cooperative actually offers, because what it offers is not simply work, but a form of community. Members often speak of recognising something within another immediately, a space of shared understanding that does not require explanation. Experiences shaped by violence can be spoken or left unspoken without fear of judgment. The act of gathering, of sewing, of sitting together and of talking becomes part of how recovery is sustained. So, rethinking value. One of the most striking aspects of the cooperative is its approach to income distribution. Rather than linking earnings to individual productivity, income is shared among the members equally. In conventional economic terms, this may appear inefficient, but within this context, it reflects a different logic, one shaped by interdependence rather than competition. Some women are able to work consistently, whilst others face illness, trauma, or physical limitation. Equal distribution ensures that participation is not conditional on constant output. Rather, it allows the cooperative to function as a collective system of support. Here, stability is prioritised over efficiency, inclusion over optimisation. And yet, this model exists within constraint. Income remains modest and variable, tied to fluctuating demand. The cooperative provides resilience, but not security. So, why does this matter? What this reveals is a more complex picture of recovery. It is not a singular achievement, nor is it delivered solely through institutions or markets. It is sustained through smaller, often less visible structures, through communities such as Abasangiye that adapt to conditions that remain unresolved. These spaces do not replace formal systems, but they absorb what those systems cannot fully address, the long-term, intimate, and often invisible effects of sexual violence. So, to close, this podcast has offered some context for the themes explored in my article, Shared Threads, Gendered Violence and the Collective Reconstruction in Post-Genocide Rwanda. The article itself looks more closely at how recovery is lived within these kinds of spaces, how economic activity, social support and memory become intertwined in ways that are difficult to measure but essential to understand. Thank you for listening.